The Second World War dramatically changed the lives and attitudes of American women. The nation was strapped for manpower. Industry and the armed forces as well actively recruited women, asking them to take on demanding and responsible jobs outside the home, at least for the duration of the war. So many women began working in areas that had been traditionally male. But as women discovered, the men in charge considered that change only temporary. The campaign to recruit nurses to serve in the armed forces did not strike Americans as unusual. Nursing was considered an appropriate profession for women, and women as Army and Navy nurses had been part of the American scene ever since the Spanish-American War. What was surprising was the number of American nurses who answered the call in World War II and served on active duty, 74,000.
Fort Devens, Massachusetts, training center for United States Army nurses. They all have officers' ratings and go through a final 4 weeks course that closely parallels their brother officers' basic training. Thorough military orientation and physical conditioning fit them for service wherever American troops go. They'll fill jobs on hospital ships and trains, field hospitals, and behind the front lines evacuating wounded, sometimes under fire. The next time these officer nurses crawl, it may be on some foreign soil in aid of a wounded American soldier. No worry about keeping slim-waisted for these stout-hearted girls, and the Army needs thousands more like them.
America honors Army nurses who served under fire in the Philippines. Heroines of Manila, of Bataan and Corregidor, their deeds have written an epic chapter in U.S. history. Mrs. Roosevelt looks on as 6 who came back received medals for valor. To student nurses, their courage is an inspiration. Caring for the wounded until told to go, they were the last to leave.
Not all the nurses in the Philippines escaped. When Bataan and Corregidor fell to the Japanese, 11 Navy nurses, 66 Army nurses were among the Americans captured, and they spent 3 years in Japanese prison camps. As the war progressed, thousands of American nurses left the military and naval hospitals in the United States and went overseas. They served in every theater of operations, caring for the wounded, working with the surgeons, often in field hospitals very close to the actual fighting. More than 200 Army nurses were killed. 17 are buried in U.S. military cemeteries overseas. The American Armed Forces began recruiting women for non-combatant jobs to replace men who were needed to fight overseas. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Almost 300,000 American women enlisted and served on active duty during the war. These military women were not nurses. They were something new in American life.
In Washington, the commander of the newly formed Women's Army Auxiliary Corps begins her duties. A housewife and mother, she will direct an army of 250,000 women. Women who will work behind the lines, relieving more men for combat duty in the field. For the first time in history, the Army now has an authorized army of women.
Americans worried out loud and in print about the military women's safety or virtue or both. The newsreel saw her as a sexy wartime novelty and painted a bright picture of female life in the Army. In reality, the military women often had to overcome condescension, prejudice, and resentment, but they persisted. The women picked up new skills, and most important, they won a permanent place in the American Armed Forces. The Army shipped 17,000 WACs overseas. They were the exceptions. Most American service women, like the Coast Guard spars, were assigned to jobs in the United States.
These spars at the Coast Guard training station in Atlantic City have completed a concentrated 20 weeks course in radio reception to qualify as radio men 3rd class. They'll replace male operators on shore stations and release the men for sea duty. Commander Dorothy Stratton awards the coveted certificates. 53 girls are freeing men to fight, but 3,000 more are needed. This is our war too, girls.